He should not become a ruler, and he would never become a tyrant. The only prophecy attributed to a young boy named Joseph Dzhugashvili was accidental death in young childhood, but owing to unbelievable circumstances, he survived. As gratitude to God for his salvation, he graduated from a religious school and entered a theological seminary. He planned to be a priest until he met a man who changed his life. After that meeting, he changed his name and date of birth. He started to lead a double life. Soon the world would know him under the name of Stalin, literally meaning a man made of steel, a cruel ruler deprived of emotions and feelings. Only a few friends would remember the old Joseph, a timid and shy boy from the town of Gori. What happened to that boy after the tragic accident in Gori? Who made him change? And why did a shy seminarist turn into a bloody murderer and despot? You will uncover the secrets of Joseph Dzhugashvili, the secrets which, if disclosed, could lead to the death sentence. You will see 2 horoscopes of Joseph Stalin and hear a sensational discovery made by astrologists based on the ruler's death mask.
Тот образ вождя, который нам внушали с детства, этой маской сразу разрушается.
It happened in 1890 in a small town of Gori in Georgia. A choir of boys were singing a canticle on the street. A phaeton was approaching. Suddenly, the horse jerked at its reins and neighed. It happened so quickly that the children and their teacher didn't understand what was going on. The horse galloped towards the singing boys. They all ran away, except for 12-year-old Soso. The horse kicked Soso over. Soso appeared to be dead. If the horse had kicked Soso in the head, it could have changed the history of the Soviet Union forever. The 12-year-old could have died under the phaeton's wheels, or he could have died of smallpox when he was 5. He could have died before his first birthday, just like his brothers. But he was destined to live a long life. For a small Georgian boy, Gori was a God-forsaken town. The son of a shoemaker and a laundress, he would go on to become the leader of the largest country on earth. He would be known to the world as Joseph Stalin. In 1932, Soviet newspapers remembered that accident in Gori and, furthermore, published an interview with Stalin's mother. In that interview, she told of how her child Soso had been a very sickly, timid boy. Finally, she admitted it would have been better if he'd become a priest. Stalin could hardly contain his anger. It took him 30 years to gain absolute power. For 10 years, he held power in his hands, but was surrounded by enemies who raked through his past, trying to find some compromising information that would destroy him. But they would fail. The same day, the Politburo of the Central Committee, governing body of the Communist Party, received an angry letter saying, "Avoid any new interviews with my mother and any other unnecessary publicity into our newspapers. Spare me those scoundrels' search for sensations." Until Stalin's death, his official biography contained only 3 phrases: born in Gori, commenced revolutionary fight at the age of 15, headed the party and the state after Lenin's death. Stalin suppressed any attempts to shed light on his youth. What was the people's father hiding? A strong kick, no internal damages. A doctor prescribed rest and a good diet. Ekaterina Dzhugashvili, or Keke as she was known by her neighbors and relatives, shed bitter tears over her son. How could her only son die from a horse kick? Keke leant over the boy. God, why do you make him suffer so? A doctor said, good diet. Where do I get the money? My husband will come soon, drunk and impoverished. Besso, the shoemaker, always spends everything he earns in the pub. He doesn't care about his crippled son. Once the kid almost died because of his father. The tragedy happened when Joseph had just celebrated his 6th birthday. Keke worked as a laundress at the house of a wealthy wine merchant. From morning till night, she rinsed linen in the ice-cold waters of Kura, and at night, she darned the merchant's shirts. Her husband, Vissarion, Besso, made shirts during the day and in the evening wasted his money in the pub. Sosso was left alone and begged God not to allow night to return. For at around midnight every night, his father would come back from the pub, and all hell would break out. However, that night, Vissarion came earlier than usual. His wife put supper on the table and quickly returned to her sewing work. This made her husband angry. How humiliating! She should stand at his side while he is eating. Vissarion rushed over to his wife and started beating her. Sosso, in an attempt to protect his mother, rushed over to his father. But his father grabbed him by the collar and threw him to the floor before kicking him hard. Hearing Keke's awful cries, the neighbors rushed over and tied the hooligan up. 2 weeks later, Sosso found blood in his urine. The father had damaged his kidney. Vissarion Dzhugashvili drank hard. He often came home without his belt, the last thing for a Georgian to do. What was going on in his soul? What grief was he trying to drown in wine? Why did he vent his spleen upon his only son and wife? No one will ever know. In an attempt to explain those fits of anger, some biographers of Stalin have suggested that Besso the shoemaker took revenge on his wife and hated his son because he was not the real father. Since Stalin's death, several possible real fathers have come to light. However, only 2 of them were the focus of rumor.
В нынешнем городе Горе, несмотря на то, что там почитает Сталин, там все убеждены, что настоящим отцом Сталина был Игнаташвили, купец тамошний.
Iakov Ignatashvili was a rich wine merchant. Keke worked for him. He took pity on the mother and son and often helped them with money and food. And later, he paid for Sosso's studies at the Gori Theological School. This financial support is confirmed in the memoirs of Stalin's mother. They were found recently in the state archives of Georgia. That generosity can hardly be deemed a confirmation of a relationship between the master and his laundress. There is evidence that Iakov Ignatashvili was just a very kind and sentimental person. He did not have his own children, and that's why he helped the children of others. But humans always remain human. There were so-called well-wishers in Gori who told Vissarion that the master of charity had other motives, and he tormented his wife with jealousy. Young Joseph heard it all. What was he able to understand at the time? The older he became, the more contempt he felt towards his mother.
Что касается матери Сталина, потому как Сталин к ней относился, можно предположить, что он считал себя действительно ублюдком, бастардом. Сами по себе слухи о том, что он незаконно рожденный, его, конечно, травмировали. Детскую, юношескую психику такие вещи очень сильно травмировали.
There is evidence from one of Stalin's contemporaries that once, during a conversation, he called his mother a whore. Was this bitter conclusion based on his childhood experience? It's unlikely. Usually, people keep such thoughts to themselves, especially lonely, selfish people like Stalin. It means that this confession, which seemed so sincere, was for some reason beneficial. But why? He wanted those rumors about it. A supposition that Stalin's real father was a well-known Russian traveler named Przhevalsky was on everybody's lips. Back then, people could be wiped off the face of the earth for being rude about Stalin. It looks as though Stalin wanted to turn those rumors to his benefit. The Tsar of the huge empire, with Russians as the dominating nation, preferred that his father be an outstanding Russian scientist than a Georgian drunk. Except for the likeness in appearance, there are no other confirmations that Przhevalsky was Stalin's father. Stalin's temper does not leave any room for doubt. Besso the irresolute, revengeful, despotic shoemaker can be clearly seen in Stalin. He hated his father and was ashamed of him. But with age, he became increasingly like his father. The day the boy was hit by a phaeton, his mother felt shock. She urgently needed money. She went to the man who never helped her, to Ignatashvili the merchant. He expressed sympathy for her and generously gave her money to buy medicines and food for the child. Keke prudently divided the money into several portions and hid them so that her drunkard husband could not find them. Next day, she saw that the hiding place had been discovered and that the money was gone. That evening, Besso, drunk as usual, returned home. His wife rushed over to him and asked where the money was. Besso's eyes became bloodshot. He demanded to know where she had got the money. Keke had to confess. He behaved as though he'd caught her cheating. Besso rushed at her. Soso grabbed a knife and threw it at his father's back. But he missed. He assumed his father would kill him. But instead, Besso took the knife and asked, "Could you really kill me, son?" And in his eyes, he read, "Yes." Several years later, a book by a Georgian writer Kazbeki titled Patricide would get into Joseph's hand. One of the book's heroes, a noble robber and people's venger, would leave a lasting impression. His name was Koba. Later, a young revolutionary, Joseph Dzhugashvili, would take it as his nickname. Soso will never forget the day when he laid his hands on his father. He felt a sense of satisfaction. Those offenses could not be forgiven. They needed to be avenged. A single occurrence at the theological school where he studied convinced him that this conclusion was right. Coming soon. Stalin's hidden defect. Why didn't he take his shoes off in the presence of strangers? A bloody revenge upon a betrayer friend. How an executioner was born. Gurdjieff, the occultist. A life-changing prophecy for a theological school student, Stalin. Why did Stalin change his date of birth? An unbelievable discovery using a death mask. Pious Keke believed that becoming a priest would be the most worthy career for her only son. When Soso entered the Gori Theological School, she was overjoyed. She didn't realize that Joseph had only chosen to become a priest to annoy his father. Vissarion wanted Soso to become a shoemaker because he believed he was stupid. On hearing this, 9-year-old Soso went crazy and resolved to prove that he had talent. He would get a degree and become a priest. He would become a metropolitan and then a patriarch. His father would regret what he had said. Soso became a clever, diligent student. Teachers said only good things about him. This boosted his self-esteem. Initially unsociable and taciturn, he began to take part in school activities, and soon he made a real friend. Soso loved him with all his heart. He had never had any friends. He was glad that finally there was someone to talk to and to share his thoughts. It was to this boy that Soso revealed his big secret. He did not know yet what betrayal meant. On summer days, senior students were allowed to go to the river to swim, accompanied by a teacher. The 13-year-old boys splashed around, but only Soso stayed on the bank. He refused to swim and wouldn't even walk barefoot in the sand along the bank. It was not for the first time, and now his schoolmates refused to believe that he was just afraid of catching cold. They decided to find out why Soso had not taken his shoes off.
Один из сверстников, видя, что Иосиф Dzhugashvili с неохотой снимает обувь, как-то над ним слегка пошутил, говорит: «Ты что, у тебя там скрывается дьявольская копытца?»
Soso stiffened. Who said that? He could not believe his ears. He recognized the voice of his friend. Let's take his shoes off. You'll see it with your own eyes. Soso's reaction slowed down. This psychological feature of stiffening in critical situations first manifested itself during the accident with the phaeton. All the children scattered in different directions. Joseph was so scared he couldn't move. As a result, he was severely injured. He had the same reaction in June of 1941. The news that the war had broken out shocked Stalin so much that he became utterly speechless and hid himself away at his summer house. Molotov had to announce a general mobilization. Only 10 days later, Stalin, emaciated and wizened, would find the strength to make a speech to his people. He couldn't move. Fear had paralyzed his will. His schoolmates knocked him to the ground and started to take off his shoes. He fought back, but it was an uneven confrontation. Fortunately, the teacher stepped in. Joseph was left alone. He wiped away the tears of humiliation while his former friend was jeering at him, just like the others. Devil, we will bring you out into the open. Stalin's medical card says, webbing of fingers on left foot. The nature of that mutilation is unknown. It may be the consequence of the accident with the phaeton, since witnesses said the phaeton ran over the boy's feet. On the other hand, it may be a congenital defect, which is common for children of alcoholics. This defect has a very unpleasant name, devil's hoof. Sosso felt shy because of it and hid the defect. The only person to whom Sosso entrusted his secret was that boy who organized the persecution on the riverbank. They were in the bathhouse, and Joseph showed him the mutilation. He was Sosso's friend and promised him to keep it a secret. In the end, he betrayed him and tried to dishonor him in front of the others. That accident changed his attitude towards people for the rest of his life. Trust no one, since even a friend may betray you. He never made another friend. There were some acquaintances whom he used. There were comrades. But he carefully locked all his secrets and personal worries deep inside his soul. After the accident, Sosso longed for revenge. The betrayer must regret what he had done. Joseph Dzhugashvili did not forgive offenses and humiliations. After the incident, Sosso became friends with the toughest boy in the school, whose name was Zaradze. Several months later, Zaradze, on Sosso's order, attacked the betrayer. Sosso watched the boys fight, but did not join in. He felt satisfaction watching his one-time friend writhing in pain, especially when he started begging for mercy. He felt power over another human being for the first time. He was the only one who could decide whether the offender should live or die. A thought flickered through his head. The betrayer should die. The victim wheezed and choked with blood. Suddenly, Joseph saw a teacher running to them and told Zaradze to stop the execution. After the beating, the victim was sent to hospital where doctors claimed that it was pure chance that the boy had survived. The incident was reviewed by the administrative board of the school. Joseph was scared since punishment looked inevitable. In the end, the hired executioner, Zaradze, was expelled and Sosso was left alone. After all, he was the best student and had not actually taken part in the violence. When everything was over, Joseph breathed a sigh of relief. He realized that revenge should be carried out by others. It was not so sweet, but much safer. Many years later, he would use this principle to build a powerful machinery of repression. The effect would be astonishing. For a long time after dethronement of the personality cult, people would say, the blood of millions is on the hands of Eshov, Beria, and others. And Stalin, as a kind of czar, did not know anything, and hence was not guilty. Joseph graduated from the theological school with honors. He passed with an excellent Mark 10 out of 12 examination disciplines. The diploma allowed him to continue studies at the Tiflis Theological Seminary. Furthermore, as the best graduate, Joseph Dzhugashvili was exempt from paying for his education and the government paid for it. His mother was happy. Her dream had come true. Her son would make a career in the church, and then everything in his life would be perfect. Let God give her the chance to stay alive till that moment. Joseph listened to his mother and thought of the event that had shattered his belief in God. He couldn't tell Keke about that because he himself was afraid to admit it, but the recollection of that event did not leave him. When he was in the second form at school, he and his friends saw a public execution for the first time. Their teacher had taken them there to show where sinners end their days. At the gibbet. But the 12-year-old teenagers were depressed by what they saw. Their minds could not match the commandment "do not kill," which was preached at school, with the execution of 2 peasants. Especially as during one of the executions, a rope broke. At that moment, Sosso breathed a sigh of relief. There is an unwritten rule that no one could be executed twice. But then he looked on with astonishment. The rope was replaced. The priest on the scaffold turned away indifferently, and the peasant was hanged. When the shock was over, Sosso believed that he had been fooled at the theological school. In real life, common people and even priests breach God's commandments. After graduation, he reached a crossroads. He longed to leave Gori and enter to a big, wide world in order to change his fate. But he was eaten up with doubt. He did not see why he should have to enter the church. He had nothing to prove to his father any longer. Several years had passed since Vissarion Dzhugashvili was killed for his debts in the pub. Should he become a seminary student for the sake of the mother? She would be glad. She believed that sooner or later her son would make his way to the top of the church hierarchy. She didn't ask whether his faith was strong or whether he was worthy of such a reward. Suddenly, Joseph understood. It was not faith that mattered, but power. He would be worshipped. He would be respected. He could remit sins or impose punishments. He would be like a god on earth. As for his doubts, should it not be seminary's job to strengthen his belief in God? He suffered. Everything turned out to be different from what he expected it to be. The strictest regime was established at the seminary. Endless church services, studies, prayers, a 2-hour walk around the town, and prayers again. At 10 in the evening, candles were put out and the seminary was plunged into a deep sleep. Time after time, Joseph regretted his decision to continue his studies. In that semi-prison atmosphere, dreams about his forthcoming career and his future grandeur looked unrealistic. He felt like an innocent prisoner. He was 17 and in despair. Recently, he read a book by Darwin, Origin of Species, and made the final conclusion that they were deceived at the seminary. God did not exist. But what did exist? What should he believe in and strive for? His eyes were opened when a student friend from a senior course showed him a shabby book titled Revolutionaries' Catechism, saying it contained the answer to Joseph's questions. However, he warned that the book was forbidden, and one could be expelled or even put into jail for having it. Marxism was spreading over Russia and found a fertile ground in the minds of students who doubted their faith. Service to a new Messiah. The hard-working people who were full of self-sacrifice. They compared themselves to the early Christians. Joseph felt that he had found his calling. At last, he had a goal and had found comrades who shared the same ideals. Together, they started attending meetings of an illegal Marxist group. He gave up his studies, stayed late in town, came home late, and spent hours in jail. Even his mother's persuasions did not help. She came to see her son, but found him in jail. When she asked why he was there, he said, "For the book that showed how to overthrow the Tsar." She was terrified and begged him to give up his rebellious thoughts. His soul was torn between pity and anger towards her. There was no point in explaining, as she would not understand. Keke looked at her son and did not recognize him. However, she felt that her precious son had gone down a wrong and dangerous road which she couldn't understand. But where did he get that confidence and that cold stare? These were the eyes of a man who knows what he wants. She did not know that Joseph had already met a person who would change his life forever. At the meetings of the Marxist group, he found a new friend, a senior student at the same seminary, George Dzhugashvili, who became a world-renowned philosopher, occultist, and astrologist. When he attended meetings, discussions about the forthcoming revolution always turned to mystical matters.
Это, в общем-то, вот эта тяга к оккультным каким-то ритуалам магическим, скорее черно-магическим, среди пламенных революционеров и большевиков, к сожалению, была распространена под маской материалистов, атеистов и борцов с этим самым, с религиозным сознанием. Они занимались чуть ли не магическими ритуалами.
Gurdjieff possessed ancient magical knowledge. He showed his comrades some rituals, taught the fundamentals of astrology, and even predicted the future. It was Gurdjieff who told Stalin, "You will become a great man and reign over millions of people. But if you want this, you will need to find your own path." He read this as meaning that the revolutionary struggle would bring him greatness. Koba left the seminary. He had nothing more to do there. He continued to attend the meetings of the Marxist group and found a regular job at the Tiflis Observatory. At that time, the observatory was not equipped with self-recording devices, and movement of celestial bodies was recorded manually during the day and at night. Koba's shift fell on December the 31st, 1899, the beginning of the 20th century, in which he was destined to play the most important historical figure on Earth. Nobody will ever know whether it was mere chance that Koba's shift had fallen on New Year's Eve 1900 and what he spoke to the stars about. But one thing is clear, he knew for sure that the stars governed human fate. Gurdjieff convinced him of that. We can only assume that it was that night at the beginning of a new century, when looking at the stars and trying to understand their path, that Joseph understood what Gurdjieff had meant by his words. A new way which Joseph had to choose and which would lead him to the summit of power. This was nothing more than a new horoscope. Changing the year of someone's birth could alter their whole life. Some researchers assume that it was Gurdjieff who chose a new date of birth for Stalin. There is no evidence to confirm this, but modern astrologists say that his horoscope was made by a highly qualified professional for a person who longed for unlimited power. For instance, the choice of December the 21st instead of December the 18th is more than fortunate for a future ruler.
По древним календарям это день самой длинной ночи, самого короткого дня, когда наиболее активны темные силы, и когда появляется герой, который побеждает тьму.
That's because a hero vested with huge power could be born on December the 21st and never on December the 18th, as Stalin had.
В этом гороскопе, в его личном гороскопе, не было власти. Для этого нужно было сделать нечто другое, что он и сделал. И власть появилась.
Pavel Glober helped us to match the meaning of positions of the Sun, the Moon and Mars in the Stalin's first and second horoscopes. Here are the results. The horoscope of the person born on December the 18th, 1878, Joseph Dzhugashvili date of birth, is that of a powerless and selfish person with many enemies, maniacally stubborn, predisposed to brain diseases and poor health. In contrast to that, the person born on December the 21st, 1879 was the absolute opposite. He was destined to succeed in all his undertakings, would have glory and power and good health. He was straightforward, but would come to power through unkind means. Stalin publicly announced his new date of birth, but only 20 years after his first contact with the astrologist. Why did he spend 20 years working his way to the top under the original unflattering horoscope? Pavel Glober believes that as a mystic, Stalin believed he had to wait for the right moment when a new horoscope would become a vital necessity. And that moment came on April the 3rd, 1922. It was the date of the party convention which had to make a final decision whether Stalin would become the ruler of the state.
Его сознательное изменение даты рождения и включение нового гороскопа для него был не просто так, а некий магический акт, на который он пошел сознательно, сделал это на съезде, меняет свою анкету, он зачеркивает свою дату, это сохранился, этот вот листок, где это все впервые он делает, потому что до этого в анкетах он фигурирует 1878 года.
The years of birth clearly show that Joseph Dzhugashvili chose the new horoscope only when he became Stalin. The second horoscope says that year of birth to be 1879.
1879 год – это год желтого кота по восточному календарю. Желтый кот всегда считается, как человек, сидящий в норе, создающий себе свою собственную команду. Кот всегда считался по восточному календарю, это всегда очень хитрое и коварное существо, которое всегда действует из-под тишка.
Caution, careful consideration, guile and meanness. These are the traits which Stalin was known for. In the first horoscope, his year of birth was 1878, the year of the tiger. A person born in this year is characterized by ardor, fervor, enthusiasm, and recklessness. Koba was exactly like that when he started his ascent to power.
Но ничего больше, скажем, умения и показателей на то, чтобы добиться высшего положения в обществе, в этом гороскопе нет. Сильная личность, действительно такой, идущий на крайние меры, но с ограниченными возможностями. Дата его рождения, та самая дата, которой он родился, 18 декабря, это дата сильного человека, сильной личности, но, скорее всего, человек, который занимается террористической деятельностью, либо бандита, уголовника.
That was the horoscope under which Stalin, then known as Koba, began his road to absolute power. He firstly became a member of the Tiflis Committee of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party and organized Marxist meetings and demonstrations of workers in Tiflis and Batumi. Those demonstrations were broken up by the police and blood was shed. Koba was shocked. Although it was not the first time that he'd seen death, although back then it had been the death of his comrades at the hands of hostile strangers. Koba believed in a death for a death. The Caucasus choked with blood. Staying in immigration, Lenin was satisfied. We may say that open revolutionary movement has begun in the Caucasus. It was at that time that Lenin first reported about Koba, a reliable leader of the revolutionary underground in Georgia. That was the beginning of his career. And then there were the things that Stalin, the ruler, feared to think about until the end of his life. things which, if disclosed, could deprive him of the most precious thing in his life: power. That is why he would thoroughly cover up any tracks and destroy any person who got in his way. Lenin and other leaders in immigration took every opportunity to acquire money. They organized armed robberies of banks and of capitalists. In the revolutionary business slang, it was called an expropriation. However, it was risky for the leaders to use their own hands. Besides, there was no need as long as there were reliable comrades in Russia. Koba eagerly tackled the job. He made his friends leaders of the gang. His childhood friend Simon Terpetrosyan, aka Camo, and seminary mate Alexander Svanidze. Over several weeks, the armed gang robbed many special-purpose teams of the state bank with dozens of victims. But Lenin's reserves ran to hundreds of thousands of rubles. Only Camo and Svanidze knew that those bloody X's were organized by Koba. That knowledge would cost them dearly in the future. Lenin learned about that from Koba and appreciated the help of a comrade from the Caucasus. Since then, Koba's career went uphill. At the same time, Koba came to the attention of the police. He was arrested and put into a cell with criminals. For the police, he was just another criminal. However, his cellmates saw that he was different. They thought that he might be a political leader. Maybe he fought against the Tsar. He should therefore be shown a lesson. Koba might be beaten to death, but when jail guards started beating the criminals, Koba acted in an unexpected way. He grabbed a weapon and started protecting his cellmates. Now it looked like a riot against jail abuse of power, with Koba as the leader of the riot. At first, the criminals couldn't understand what had happened. Then he was exiled to Siberia, but escaped after 2 years. He returned back to Tiflis, where the police knew him by sight. Was it so difficult for the police to arrest Koba and send him to the place from which nobody could run away? It's incredible. He managed to remain in hiding for 4 years. The archives of the former gendarme department kept 3 reports about Dzhugashvili's arrests. He was arrested, but then released. He had organized bloody robberies, was a jailbreaker, a man outside the law with a forged passport. Why? There is only one explanation. Koba knew how to strike a deal not only with criminals, but with the secret political police as well. In other words, he cooperated with the police in exchange for his personal freedom. To be more precise, he betrayed his comrades. No direct evidence has been found as yet, which may be the reason why Stalin prohibited anyone rummaging through his past. We only know that living in hiding was the happiest and unhappiest time of his private life. During those 4 years, he met and lost his first love. Now they both were members of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, revolutionary underground comrades. It was at his comrade's house that Koba saw the younger sister of his comrade. He was shocked. The girl's resemblance to his mother was striking. It was no surprise that her name was Ekaterina Keke. It could not be otherwise. He was 25 and a tough revolutionary who had been through jail and exile. But beside that 19-year-old girl, he felt like young Soso again. He was so shy and tried hard to hide his passion for Cato. Finally, he asked her to marry him. Cato agreed. She was brought up in the Caucasian traditions and remembered the words of her deceased mother. Your husband is not the one who conquers you, but the one to whom you submit. The newlyweds settled at Svanidze's house. Cato's sister Maria often came to visit her, and Koba's underground comrade, Simon Terpetrosian, often visited. Alexander Svanidze and his wife always kept an open table and eagerly invited Koba, Cato, and their guests over. The men drank wine, joked, and quietly discussed their revolutionary plans. The women did not interfere and had their own conversations. These were the good times. Everybody was young and happy. The only blot on Cato's happiness were Koba's constant absences. Sometimes he'd be away for weeks. When he came back unexpectedly, he would always be greeted with a good meal. Koba was surprised. "How did you know I was coming home today?" She lowered her eyes shyly. "I felt it." The Georgians have a tradition that still survives in places, that a woman does not have the right to sit at a table with a man. She should stand beside him, ready to serve at any moment. But Koba breached this tradition intentionally. He vividly remembered how his father was outraged if his mother was unable to stand near the table, even though she had lots of work to do. He would not be like his father. Koba asked Cato to sit at the table beside him. He put food on her plate and sat so that he could look at her. Once, Alexander Svanidze came round and saw his sister sitting at the table. He threw her an indignant look. How dare she eat a lavish meal in the presence of her husband? Cato's heart stopped beating. She hoped Koba would explain that he liked to watch her eat, but instead, Koba started shouting and complaining that Cato was bad-mannered and ignored traditions. Svanidze could not look him in the eyes. When Alexander left, Koba started scolding his wife. He shouted and stamped his feet. Why hadn't she been sensible and hidden the plate under the table? As he was scolding Cato, he began to despise himself for behaving like his father, the man he hated and never wanted to resemble. Cato burst into tears. Her tears broke Koba's heart. He clasped her to his chest and whispered, "Forgive me, Cato." She forgave him. But since then, uninvited guests would often find a place with unfinished supper under the table.
З роками це дивацтво Коби переросте у манію Сталіна. Він любив примушувати.
Over the years, Koba's eccentricity would develop into a real mania for Stalin.
Очевидно, вкладав це якийсь особливий, лише йому відомий сенс.
He liked to force people to eat and drink, for when a person is eating or drinking, he is especially vulnerable.
Як колись Като. Від коша
His actions were rebuffed only once when at a crowded reception in the Kremlin,
гукне своїй друзі.
he shouted at his second wife, Nadezhda Aliyeva,
Ти чому не п'єш?
"Hey, why don't you drink?"
А у відповідь почує: я тобі не
She replied, "I am not your hey."
Наступного ранку Надію Алілуєву
Next morning, Nadezhda Aliyeva was found dead. She had shot herself.
став останньою краплею в чаші її терпіння.
In 1907, Cato gave birth to a son, Jakov. Koba saw him only in November when he returned after a number of successful exes. When he arrived home, he was surprised to find supper was not on the table. Cato had a fever. After labor, she fell ill with typhus. In the morning, she died. Koba was destroyed. Witnesses said that during the funeral, he jumped into his wife's grave. He cried during the funeral and said, This creature made my stone heart turn soft. Now she is gone, and I have no warm feelings left for humanity. Koba would subsequently die, making way for Comrade Stalin's rise to power. At the summit of power, he would turn on the new horoscope to separate Stalin the ruler from the half-educated seminary student Dzhugashvili and the terrorist and criminal Koba forever. The new Stalin would need a new ideologically perfect biography written. There would be no room for any facts about the real Joseph Dzhugashvili. He would change his horoscope and his biography, but he could never change who he was.
Сам Сталин самого себя от своего образа отделял. Вот образ Сталина-вождя отразился в том гороскопе, который он включил для всего советского народа. Это Сталин-вождь. Но жил он по своему собственному гороскопу, о котором мало кто знал.
This dualism was the cause of his unending fear, the fear that he would be unmasked. The new Stalin was never able to renounce the ghost of his past, a past that did not match the image of a superman, an undisputable leader, a born ruler of the masses. This is the death mask of Joseph Stalin. Looking at it, you can easily understand what kind of a person he really was.
Я, например, бы никогда не сказал, что это железный стальной человек. Вообще вот такие вот линии носа и глаз, вот выпуклые глаза, говорят о гордыне и деспотичности, о человеке, который был уверен в себе. Я говорю, единственной здесь чертой – это линия подбородка. Нетерпелив, горяч, вспыльчив, слишком пристрастен. Вот это действительно, к сожалению, это есть, реально. И, конечно, низко посаженные брови. Брови человека, фиксирующегося на обидах. Вот откуда ни желание, ни умение прощать. Вот откуда жесткость и откуда такое подавление других.
The only things that disclose his internal lack of self-confidence are his ears. Their position on the head is too low. Usually, such ears belong to people who are not destined to become great. However, these men can become great if they reinvent themselves.
Это люди, учащиеся, которые учатся на своих ошибках. Очень редкая линия ушей. Для человека, который сам себя сделал, эти линии ушей идеальные. Это которые все запоминают, которые живут прошлым, для которых ни один день не является лишним и напрасным, которые постоянно возвращаются к тому, что они прожили раньше.
Even having reinvented himself and gaining power, he turned his back on his past with maniacal consistency. As if waiting to be stabbed in the back by all those people who had witnessed the mistakes of his youth. From those who remembered his terrorist acts and robberies. And from those who suspected that Koba worked for the secret political police. Kamo, a faithful friend of Koba, died in 1922 under strange circumstances. He was run over by a car. This was odd, because there were very few cars in Tbilisi. Alexander Zvanidze, Koba's closest comrade and brother of his beloved wife, would be arrested and executed in August 1941. A little earlier, in 1937, Maria Zvanidze, who had been a frequent guest of the younger sister Kato and her husband Joseph 30 years ago, would also be shot. Stalin hoped that if he killed anyone associated with his former life, there would be no one to unmask left to him. But he was wrong. Living a lie tormented him for the rest of his life. Gradually, that fear of being uncovered developed into paranoia for the tyrant who had ruined the lives of millions of innocent people. The entire country was mourning and kissing his portraits. On March the 9th, 1953, the Soviet Union was paying its last tribute to Joseph Stalin. On that day, hundreds of people were killed in the crowd, making their way to the deceased leader. And no one knew that the body in the coffin was not worth the sacrifice. The corpse wasn't that of Stalin. Sensational details of the death of the Kremlin's master. It is not Stalin who's been buried near the Kremlin wall. The real leader had died before his official date of death. The secret life of the Soviet dictator. How many doubles did Joseph Stalin have? It seemed that Stalin visited different occasions with different ears. Who had prepared them and why? And what fate awaited the directors of this performance? People who were directly related to Stalin's doubles were shot. We will conduct our own investigation and find unique evidence. We will analyze the newsreels from those times. With the help of experts, we will determine how to distinguish the fake leader from the real one. If you take these two pictures, you can see that the ears belong to totally different people. And most importantly, we will find out what really happened to Joseph Stalin. December 31st, 1939. The Kremlin guards didn't like New Year celebrations because of the crowds that gathered outside the door. Suddenly, the crowd parted to allow the Kremlin master to make his way through. The usual slight smile on his face. The guards saluted. Everything went according to plan. Nobody could have guessed the surprise that awaited them. A moment later, through the same doors, another Stalin would enter. This incident is described in a book by a man named Sergei Krasikov. The guard who was on duty that night in the Kremlin. But what was it? A ghost or a hoax? That's how they tried to explain it to the frightened guard. Along with Comrade Stalin, there came a heavily made-up actor, Gelovani, to the Kremlin. However, the guards knew the actor was at least a head taller than Stalin. It turns out, Stalin really did have doubles. But when exactly had they appeared? Ears are a unique part of the human body. People may be similar in many ways, but no two pairs of ears are alike. It is on this basis we'll try to find out the truth. Here are some pictures of the leader. They were taken over the period of a year, but in different places. We will show these pictures to a specialist. Ukrainian expert criminologist Andrei Dubovik has agreed to help us by examining 6 different portraits of Joseph Stalin. Right now, he will determine how similar they are. Auricle, retina, and fingerprints are totally unique features that can never be repeated. Visually, you can determine if a person is very similar. The eyes, nose, or ears. But somewhere there will be a difference. So we are starting the experiment. Andrei takes photos and examines them. The first conclusions of the expert are really amazing. Here on this photo, we can see the ear of the owner, regular oval shape. If we look at another picture, Here, the ear is completely stretched out in an elongated shape, completely different. You can clearly see it when we zoom in on the photo. The ears belong to totally different people. This is surprising, but it turns out that in these particular photographs, there are two completely different people. According to experts, this is the first time the double rather than the leader was captured on newsreel. This is the parade of 1935, which was led not by Stalin, but by his double. Documents confirm that Stalin had doubles. This is completely accurate. Anyway, with the help of documents, I can confirm in a few minutes that there were such people. But why did Stalin need doubles? 1933, Abkhazia, Lake Ritsa. Stalin was having a rest. He always liked water trips. He also liked this quiet and unobtrusive Mingrelian who accompanied him everywhere. Deputy head of the Georgian NKVD, Lavrenti Beria, always subtly felt Stalin's mood. Not wanting to disturb the leader's thoughts, he stood aside. The boat was slowly approaching a wooded bank. But suddenly, something unbelievable happened. Suddenly, a body fell on top of Stalin. It was Beria who shielded the leader from fatal bullets. Who was shooting? The trembling Stalin didn't even think about it. He was too afraid to move. He could only think of one thing. If it hadn't been for Beria, he would be lying dead in the boat. But Stalin didn't realize that Beria himself had organized the attempted murder. It was just a show for one spectator, but with very clear goals. So with this attempted murder, Beria killed two birds with one stone. After the incident, he became a trusted associate of Stalin, and more importantly, he managed to convince the leader that from that moment on, his life was in constant danger. And only he, Beria, knew best how to protect the Kremlin master. Stalin was encouraged by Beria to create doubles as a form of protection for himself. A provocation was organized by Beria. It seemed to be an attack on Stalin. Beria needs to scare Stalin, make him believe that there were constant enemies who must be destroyed. 1934, suburbs of Moscow. For the third hour, Christopher was lying lost in conjectures. Who are these people that took him away in the middle of the working day? Put him in a car and took him somewhere. What did he do wrong? What did they want from him? People silently checked his eyes with a light and felt his chin. They sprinkled his face with something. Christopher felt unbearable pain. It felt as though his skin was burning. Now he had the same smallpox scars as his leader. He woke up in unbearable pain. His face was burning. What did they do to him? He was even more shocked when he looked in the mirror. Looking back at him, was Joseph Stalin. Only the man's scared eyes were different from Stalin's. A few hours later, a nurse came to the ward to check Christopher's condition, but he did not react. He could only think of one thing: to escape, to save himself, and forget the terrible nightmare. Suddenly, it dawned upon him. He threw himself at the girl's feet and asked her to send a note to inform his family about where he was and what had happened to him. Christopher did not realize his family were already dead. And no one could help him. Your name? Christopher. His old life had ended, and a new one had started. Your name? Christopher. Full of humiliation and fear. He had to learn how to talk and walk and smoke a pipe and keep his left arm motionless. In this studio was a special director who taught him Stalin's intonations, gestures. This was obligatory. There was a director, perhaps not the only one, who could teach gestures, voice, intonation and behavior, the way he holds his hands and so on. Soon he was standing on the mausoleum, greeting demonstrations and parades. As far as his colleagues were concerned, this man died in a car accident along with all his family. His name disappeared from all documents for good. As with the documents, went his entire existence. However, the truth would still come out. The directors of the show had made a huge mistake. Outsiders learned about the existence of Stalin No. 2. In the Politburo, rumors were being spread. The leader had been replaced. Gossips were soon arrested. However, the truth came out. Many years later, this story was described in a book by Stalin's former bodyguard, Sergei Krasikov. He even mentioned the full name of the double: Christopher Golshtab. Christopher, who would soon become well known. On December 6, 1934, Moscow was paying its last respects to the first secretary of the Leningrad Regional Party Committee and Stalin's favorite, Sergei Kirov. Here's a video. We can clearly see in the newsreel, along with Molotov and Budyonny, the coffin is being followed by the leader himself, or so everybody thought. And only a few knew. In fact, it was the debut of Stalin's new double, Christopher Golshtab. Behind the coffin walked a silent man. In mine and other historians' opinion, this was Stalin's first double, the silent one. He had a lot of silent doubles, unlike Stalin himself. 1935, suburbs of Moscow. Yevsey felt he was in seventh heaven. A simple accountant from Vinnytsia Oblast, he had dreamt of becoming an actor since his childhood. And now it seemed his dream was coming true. For the last 6 months, he worked with a whole crew of doctors, cosmetologists, directors, and actors. They only wanted one thing from him: to impersonate Joseph Stalin. And here he triumphed. He has become a true replica of the leader. The door opened. The main performer had arrived. A short man in a pince nez. The man who had brought Yevsey here. Lubitsky's heart started to beat loudly. The snake-like look of Comrade Beria seemed to penetrate him. But the double coped and didn't look away. Now remained the most important thing of all, to please Comrade Stalin. It was the rule. The master of the country always checked his doubles personally. An hour later, they had to meet in the Kremlin. The former accountant was feeling confident.
Они расстреливались. И люди, которые имели отношение к двойникам Сталина, такое непосредственное.
People who were directly related to Stalin's doubles were shot so as not to leave any trace. Beria knew how to cover his tracks. Therefore, he sentenced to death all the performers of the doubles transformation and to kill Lubitsky's family to keep it secret. Yevsey himself survived. In the 80s, he told his story to a Montreal newspaper. But to survive, he needed a miracle. Stalin was examining the double with contempt. Although they were identical, the leader could not deal with his background. This man was a Jew. And the ambitious Stalin could not stand it. It seemed that the decision had already been made. Let Beria liquidate this material. At first, Stalin didn't notice little Svetlana entering the room. She threw herself into the arms of the leader. A moment later, she saw her real father. It was a triumph. And Yevsey realized he had been approved and would therefore live. He interviewed some of the doubles. He had the power to say yes or no. And he loved his Lubitsky. He was a gentle, quiet man. Stalin was right. Lubitsky was a really talented actor. While Golshtab stood in the distance on the mausoleum, Lubitsky met with ambassadors and even members of the Kremlin. It entertained Stalin. He even watched these meetings through a special lens. Most of all, he enjoyed it when his subordinates abased themselves in front of his double. It made him feel euphoric. However, this was merely entertainment. The true role of Stalin's doubles remained the same. They were targets. Watch later. Amazing details of the leader's death. The real Joseph Stalin was killed a month before the official date of his death. And for a few weeks, the country was ruled by his double. Unique evidence of Soviet medics. At the Kremlin wall is buried a copy of the leader. The last mystery of Lavrenti Beria. Former head of the NKVD was shot on the day of his arrest in his private cabinet. The inquiry over Beria's double lasted 6 months. November the 6th, 1942. Moscow. The guards were tense. A car approached the front door of the Kremlin. A moment later, the master got into it. The car hadn't even made it through the gate when shots were heard. Terrified guards rushed to rescue the leader. But when they saw him, they were shocked. Stalin was covered in blood, with no signs of life. This was described by several security guards. But how surprised they must have been when the next morning they saw Stalin alive and well again. He came out of the Kremlin as if nothing had happened. But how did he manage to survive? It was a well-organized system. Every time a double came out of the front door and got into a car, Stalin would leave from the back door and drive in a different direction. This scheme never failed. On the day of the attack on the double, they managed to warn Stalin of the danger, and he simply did not leave the Kremlin. The leader appeared in front of the guards the following morning. In order to explain his remarkable recovery, he ordered a statement claiming no one died in the attack. Stalin standing on the mausoleum, Stalin in a car on the street, Stalin in the crowd. In the midst of the war, he appeared everywhere, as if signaling the leader is with his people. When they began comparing all the portraits and photographs, it appeared that Stalin had different ears. This suggested that Stalin did indeed have doubles. And it was they who were hunted by the German intelligence, the Japanese Secret Service, and the saboteurs. The KGB had been instructed to look for people similar to Stalin. They say there were 14 doubles. The system worked perfectly. During the war, there were more than 20 attempted murders. How many of them succeeded remains a mystery. But one thing is sure, the real leader survived them all. Stalin appreciated Beria's idea. The doubles were being looked for throughout the entire country, in factories and villages, but mostly on the front line. Relatives were sent a killed in battle notice. They were none the wiser and had no idea that their relative had begun a completely new and different life. Each of them had to learn how to move, behave, or even talk like Stalin. Although the lookalikes were allowed to look people in the eye and shake hands, under no circumstances were they to make speeches. And the doubles performed their roles perfectly. They were masters at parades and dinners. And they would even sit in at meetings of the Politburo when Stalin was ill. The quote from the history of Stalin's illness, 1947, quote, "The beginning, March 26, Joseph Stalin has got diarrhea. By the evening, he felt feverish. He feels generally indisposed. At 7, the temperature was 38.5 degrees. You may ask, but what does this have to do with Stalin's doubles? The answer is simple. Meanwhile, according to all the world newspapers, Stalin welcomes delegations, sits at the largest meetings. Beria, Malenkov, Voroshilov are sitting on the panel in the foreground. But for some reason, he is behind. Because it is a double, and he isn't allowed to listen to what the first people in the country say. However, there were some incidents. It was at the time of Stalin's illness when a delegation from the United States arrived in Moscow. It was too late to cancel it. If the leader hadn't shown up, it would have been disrespectful to the foreign guests. But Stalin, who at that time was lying in bed with high fever, could not come. The leader was promised that it would be merely a ceremonial meeting, and Stalin decided to take a risk and send his double. Stalin had said things that the Americans simply had to publish and say that it was not clear how to explain this to the people. Our side had no choice but to publish their own version of this meeting
Нашим ничего не остается, как тоже
and say that the Americans didn't understand it correctly.
свой вариант.
Stalin was speaking in Russian,
И сказать просто американцы не все правильно.
so they couldn't understand and translate
На
everything.
русском они не сумели все понять.
It was a double.
Это был
No matter how hard this double tried, he said something wrong. But even after that incident, the leader had retained the services of his doubles. They were a perfect weapon that saved him from death and were helpful during any illness. But there was one thing Stalin had overlooked. Very soon, this weapon would shoot back at him, and the trigger would be pulled by a man who once had raised the cock. March 1st, 1953. Suburbs of Moscow. That night, there were guests at the dacha. The leader's closest and most trusted circle. Beria, Malenkov, Bulganin, and Khrushchev. For a long time, they sat talking about business. They dispersed at 5 in the morning. The guards felt relieved. Now they could rest. However, they knew that no matter how long a party continued, at 8 a.m., Stalin would already be on his feet. But this morning was different. At 9 a.m., he was still in his bedroom. Maybe Stalin had decided to have a lie-in. By 10 a.m., the guards were beginning to worry. Maybe something had happened. But how to check? How to enter the room?
Двері до покоїв вождя.
The door to the leader's room is a no-go area for outsiders.
Неналежний момент ризикував.
Anyone who opened it at the wrong time risked their life.
Лише після такого звуку
Only after a specific sound could a person enter. Half an hour later, mail was delivered. The package was to be immediately given to Stalin. Who was to hand it over? It was decided that the job should go to Deputy Superintendent Pyotr Lozgachev. Stalin liked him. There was a chance that the man would not be punished. Lozgachev quietly opened the door. Stalin was not moving. A moment later, the house was in turmoil. They called the Kremlin. Stalin was put in bed and covered up. But then, strange things started to happen.
як розповість Микита Хрущов,
According to Nikita Khrushchev, they were informed of Stalin's strange disease on March the 2nd at 9 a.m.
вони негайно
He and Beria came to the dacha and called the doctors.
та ні на крок не
They didn't leave the leader for a moment.
але Лозгачов
But Lozgachev assures us that everything happened in a completely different way,
знайшли. Аж
and Stalin was found a day earlier. Beria allowed doctors to enter the house the next morning. X-ray, cardiogram, injections. All were made quickly and accurately. Procedures were recorded in a book, as well as a description of the patient, including any bruises and scratches. Did these people know that soon they would cause a revolution? They were about to discover that it was not Stalin whom they had treated.
журнал лікарів.
Record book of Stalin's doctors. For many years, this document was kept in the archives as classified information. But now it became available and totally changed the idea of the last days of Stalin. Medics recorded everything, even the appearance of their patient.
І виявляється,
And it turns out that this patient was not Stalin, but his double. The true leader of the Soviet Union had many physical defects. The second and third toes on his left foot were fused at birth. Leg muscles were of different thicknesses. His left hand was paralyzed, which is why he always kept it bent or hidden behind his back. But they found no such defects on the patient who died in the dacha. It's incredible, but according to the records, the patient had a completely normal body structure. On his feet, the big toenail is not cut. Nothing about the fused toes. Nothing about deformed hand during the autopsy. They described a completely different body, which indicates that it must have been a double. Thus, it wasn't Stalin, but a double. The man who replaced the leader on his deathbed. But what happened to the real Stalin? It's hard to believe, but experts say the leader died a month before his official date of death. And it was the head of Cheka, Lavrenti Beria, who took care of this. And where was the real Stalin? I do not know what Beria could have done with him, but one day he proudly announced, "I removed him." But how could this happen? What made Beria take this step? As it turned out, it was Stalin himself. The leader was afraid of power and authority, which the former Cheka officer had. Beria was becoming too dangerous, and Stalin decided to act. The leader ordered to collect compromising material on him, which over time could be used in court. This decision became fatal for the leader. Beria realized he could wait no longer. We have found evidence from Stalin's daughter Svetlana Alliluyeva. Here is what she wrote about the last few weeks of the leader's life. "My father has changed a lot. Usually he is pale. Now he has a red face. He is not talking to me, and it seems doesn't even know. What does this strange evidence mean?" Can it be that Svetlana Alliluyeva was describing her father's double? Where then has the real Stalin gone? Experts suggest Beria had got rid of the leader earlier and replaced the dead Stalin with a fake. It was a triumph. Now the double was Beria's puppet, and he could not stop him on his way to limitless power. But Beria overlooked one thing. Stalin's closest circle, Khrushchev and Malenkov, had already prepared a plan to assassinate the leader. They didn't know about the substitution. Therefore, Beria was accused of being an accomplice or an enemy. Beria could not risk his life when his dream was so close. And the former head of the Cheka could do nothing but kill Stalin for the second time. On March the 5th, 1953, in Moscow, an important event took place. Joint meeting of the Politburo, the government of the Soviet Union and the Supreme Soviet. By a unanimous vote, Comrade Beria was given full power. The other members of the four hadn't been forgotten. All of them got key positions. Exactly 1 hour after the meeting, the death of Joseph Stalin was announced. Beria was jubilant. His plan had worked. He managed to fool everyone, including Stalin and his former associates. The way to the throne was free. But one thing he didn't realize: not everyone would accept his plans. Former friends did not want to obey Beria. They knew that after his rise to power, things would be even worse than under Stalin's reign, and they already knew what to do. To use the same simple and reliable method: the doubles. The gun that had killed Stalin now had to be used against Beria. June 26, 1953, Moscow. He was sitting in his cabinet, carefully looking at some papers. Beria was preparing for the next meeting of the Politburo when the doors of his cabinet opened. In walked some military men armed with weapons. Beria rushed to the briefcase where there was a loaded pistol. But he had no time to do anything. For the next 6 months, a prison cell deep underground in a bomb shelter would become his home. And his daily duties would include attending the court hearings. Beria would be tried as a traitor to the state, a murderer and a pervert. They would remember everything: mass executions and child rape. In 1953, the entire country would learn of his crimes. However, they weren't allowed to see the criminal. The process would take place behind closed doors. But why? Because it was only a show, hastily prepared and not of high quality. November 1953, Moscow. On that day, as was traditional at the Kremlin, they were listening to the radio. From there, they heard voices of prosecutors and plenty of charges. Scandalous details of the life of the most influential man of the Union. And now, a simple defendant, Lavrenti Beria. But one thing surprised the Kremlin staff. Why were only a few allowed to witness the process? Why wasn't he being photographed? Soon, all the Kremlin would be gossiping about it. Defendant Lavrenti Beria would turn out not to be Lavrenti Beria at all. It happened at one of the hearings. On that day, they decided to question the witness, a man whose wife Beria had raped and murdered. The witness was a Mingrelian, that is, he belonged to the same nation as Beria. In anger, he suddenly spoke to the prisoner in his native language. He asked in Mingrelian if the murderer liked feeling powerless. But Beria did not understand a word and remained silent. Has Lavrenti Beria forgotten his native language? Or was that not him behind the prisoner's box? The latter could explain a lot. Why the process was closed and why photographers were not allowed in. A double prepared in haste could easily be exposed, but the organizers of this show couldn't afford for it to fail. Beria did not know that while he was making plans to become leader of the country, Malenkov and Khrushchev were already preparing a double who was to replace the original at a fake hearing. Because no one was going to judge real Beria, they dealt with him as fast as with Stalin. The murder of Beria was organized like this. The Presidium of the CC was informed that there was data incriminating Beria in the organization of armed conspiracy, armed seizure. They would therefore invite Beria to the Presidium and ask him what was going on. But what if Beria refused to come to the Presidium? Khrushchev offers to send 2 generals to bring Beria to the Presidium. When the generals returned, they said that Beria had resisted and had therefore been killed. They lied and declared that Beria had been arrested and that an investigation was underway, but Beria had been killed. Exactly 6 months later, in the chambers of the Lubyanka, his double was shot. With the official death of Beria began the era of the new masters of the Kremlin: Khrushchev, Brezhnev and Andropov. Who was pounding his desk with a shoe at the UN meeting, threatening the Americans with Kuzkina Mother? Khrushchev or his badly trained double? How had Brezhnev survived 9 attempted murders? Or could it have been the service of the doubles? Who has been appearing before us on TV, welcoming parades and ruling the state? Today, no one can be sure. The documents of that era are still kept in the archives as top secret. And along with them, the sensational facts about our modern history.
In the summer of 1927, in Sukhumi, the officers of the Soviet Secret Service were accepting an extraordinary delivery. 20 African apes sent from Guinea. The gorillas and chimpanzees were housed in a nursery that had been specially built for them. In the next room, isolated and under the watchful eye of Soviet guards, waited 5 young women. They had been chosen from hundreds of applicants who were willing to take part in an experiment that was to resemble a science fiction story. These girls, members of the Young Communist League, were to be crossbred with the African apes. The half-ape, half-humans born during that experiment were intended as donors for the Soviet governors who wanted to become immortal. In January 1924, in the Kremlin, Vladimir Lenin had been entombed. Thousands of people came to honor the dead, and they sorrowfully waited for their moment to bid farewell to the great leader. However, those who saw Lenin dying felt even deeper sorrow. These were his party members. The night before his death, Lenin suffered from 42 attacks of epilepsy. He had severe convulsions. He yelped and howled. Although he was only 53 years old, his death was very long and very painful. But why did he depart this life so young?
The resolution of the medical commission was shocking. Lenin died of atherosclerosis. A detailed examination of his brain showed that vessels in his head were weak and frayed. So, it was determined the leader died of premature aging. Bolsheviks didn't want to die early, nor did they want to die in such pain like that. The most afraid of premature aging was Stalin. His road to supreme power was too long for that.
Sometime later, Stalin had finally established himself on the Soviet throne. He had fought for it for far too long and had wanted it so much. Now he intended to rule the country for many years. But this was not only because of his thirst for power. A person who is on top of society, who has lots of power and resources to satisfy his social, mercantile, political and other ambitions. This person has something to lose. When you have something to lose, your fear to lose it grows. So people who have lots of powers, who have boundless authorities, even suffer from obsessive fear of death. Stalin knew better than anyone else what people who seek power are capable of. He had already mercilessly and systematically destroyed his competitors. And he understood that one day, stronger players would decide to remove him. Stalin realized that if he grew to be old, ill and helpless, as Lenin was in his last years, he wouldn't be able to withstand his enemies. So immediately after Lenin's death, laboratories, clinics, and research institutes of the Soviet started to search for the secret of eternal youth for Comrade Stalin.
We could overturn the world. Now we can overcome death. That became the new motto of the progressive Soviet researchers. That year, scores of scientists started their fantastical development of a new breed of human, Homo Sovieticus. These new people had to be enduring, insensitive, persistent and authoritative. Also, they had to be able to live for longer. For this purpose, another group of scientists started experiments aimed at reaching eternity. The Soviet doctors were very interested in the issue of rejuvenation. They also knew enormous sums of money could be made from it. Officials needed a guarantee of a long and comfortable life, or even immortality. Death scared them a lot. They also didn't want to die.
It was Lenin's private doctor, Abram Zalmanov, who proposed a reliable method of rejuvenation, soaking the body in the bath with turpentine. Theoretically, this procedure was said to stimulate circulation of the blood and renew the aging bodies of Kremlin bosses. However, Stalin didn't take baths with turpentine. He didn't want to take the risk, as it was rumored that one influential figure had scalded his genitals in such a bath. That is why Zalmanov's method quickly lost its popularity. Furthermore, there then appeared a new progressive method of Dr. Alexander Bogdanov. Truth be told, his method was so radical, it earned him the nickname Red Dracula in the West. It involved blood transfusions, which are very common nowadays.
So, he invented a very interesting concept. If blood transfusions are made between an old person to a young person, nothing bad will happen. Old blood will dissolve amongst young cells and will be transformed. If blood from a young person is transfused to an old man, the man will quickly rejuvenate and his health will improve. His proposition was to transfuse blood from old Bolsheviks to the young and vice versa, and thereby connect the whole country by blood.
It was an attractive idea, and immediately after the burial of Lenin, the doctor got the approval from the Kremlin. From then on, someone watched his progress very carefully and very closely. This was the person who was most interested in the treatment's development, Joseph Stalin.
In 1924, Bogdanov started his first experiments. The elderly doctor first tested the method on himself by exchanging his blood with a younger volunteer. After that, he reported, "As the result of the transfusion, my general condition, physical efficiency and appearance improved." The success was obvious. Soon after, Dr. Bogdanov was invited to the Kremlin.
"How are you feeling?" asked Stalin. "I feel much better," answered Bogdanov. At that point, he'd gone through 3 blood transfusions. "Do you think this method can rejuvenate?" asked Stalin. "We're working on it, Joseph Vissarionovich. There are prospects." That talk resulted in Stalin's consent for the organization of the Institute for Blood Transfusion in Moscow. Bogdanov became its director. Soviet universities and institutes got the orders to motivate students to donate their blood for the welfare of the homeland. In the meantime, alarming rumors started to spread in Moscow. At the markets, railway stations and bars, people whispered to one another that blood was being drained from the youth to transfuse it into the deceased Lenin and raise him from the dead. Everybody waited for the miracle and hoped that Lenin would rise again and return to work. Nobody knew that the Kremlin itself was the initiator of those rumors. And so Stalin successfully masked his own search for eternity. His hope was to rejuvenate his body through blood transfusions. However, he hadn't had the time to test his new method on himself, when suddenly, after an ordinary transfusion, Bogdanov died. It later turned out that the doctor had died because the scientific world knew nothing about rhesus factor. This protein, which can be found in the blood of humans and some animals, was only to be discovered by scientists in 1940 and would be called after the rhesus monkey, which was used for the first experiments. In the 20s, however, the incompatibility of rhesus factors destroyed Dr. Bogdanov. Stalin was very much afraid. He understood that it wasn't good to make haste with rejuvenation. Firstly, the method should be fully verified.
At that time in the Kremlin drugstores, there appeared another remedy for restoring youthfulness and longevity. It was Gravidan. This medicine was produced from the urine of pregnant women. It was invented by Soviet doctor Alexei Zamkov when he understood that pregnant women's urine is an inexhaustible source of vitamins and hormones. He tried the first experimental consignment of the remedy on himself and experienced a powerful rise of energy. After that success, the medicine was given the green light.
First-rate Soviet scientists supported Zamkov. The writer Maxim Gorky personally supervised his work. Due to his own poor health, he was very interested in these rejuvenation methods. He was not alone. Director of Operations Division of State, Political Directorate Karl Pauker, Director General of the Army Intelligence Jan Bursin, Semen Budioni, Klara Zetkin, Mikhailo Kalinin, and Lazar Kaganovich all took injections of Gravidan.
Gravidan removes the thread of impotency and euphoria. It fills you with power and cheerfulness. It's extremely good.
After only one shot, the patients felt fit, full of energy, good-humored, a desire for action, and incredible lightness. But truth be told, it didn't last long. And it was only 10 days before the next shot was needed. The main thing was that the potion was effective.
In the meantime, it became a sensation in the Soviet press. The longevity elixir was found. After a dose of Gravidan, the patient was able to work 14 hours a day and overperform by 300%. Doctors started to use Gravidan to treat impotence, cancer, depression, senile marasmus, and children's schizophrenia. Dr. Zamkov became the people's idol and the object of the poetical inspiration.
A Soviet doctor, Zamkov, and it was some 5 years ago.
He solved the problem and was concise,
as he invented such a device that makes a drug from urine, to be precise.
Let's give it the critical acclaim, Gravidan!
In spite of general excitement, Stalin underwent only one course of the Gravidan therapy. He decided not to proceed further, and later it turned out that he was right. After a few years, the side effect of Gravidan was discovered. The medicine acted like a hormonal drug and was addictive. According to the directive from the Kremlin, a common admiration for Gravidan was soon replaced by social disapproval, and Dr. Zamkov himself was called a charlatan.
How could the ongoing mystery of eternal youth be solved? While Soviet scientists tried to get to the bottom of the problem, the Kremlin turned its attention to the West. At that time in the West, there was a very popular French doctor of Russian origin, Sergei Voronov. After his unique operations, patients immediately seemed younger, became physically stronger, and more virile. What did Surgeon Voronov do? He transplanted into his patients the sexual organs of monkeys.
A French doctor with a Russian surname was not a political émigré. Before the revolution, he went from provincial Voronezh to Paris to study at the Sorbonne. During his time as a student, he took great interest in eugenics, a science about creation of the perfect human, who could live forever, or at least for a very long time. In Paris, Voronov started to search for the secret recipe of eternal youth. In the French National Library and the book depositories of Sorbonne, Voronov managed to find ancient manuscripts where he read incredible recipes of eternal youth, made up by alchemists, philosophers, doctors, and monks. Some of the recipes were far too exotic.
An example of one such recipe was, to reach eternity, you must grind a 100,000-year-old frog. To that, you must add dried spider's webs, and then the hind quarters of bats. Then you must dry it all and make a powder out of it. This powder must then be dissolved in water and taken on an empty stomach on 1 tablespoon. I wouldn't risk trying it, would you? There was another recipe from ancient Persia, which seems to be rather strange and time-consuming. Take a red-haired and freckled person and feed him with fruits, there you go, till he reaches 30 years old. Then, hermetically cork him up in stoneware, full to the brim of honey. In 120 years, the body will turn into a mummy. Then it must be turned into powder, dissolved in water, and taken over 2 months. Such food supplements guaranteed eternity if taken properly. I'm not sure if anyone has ever tried this strange recipe, but it really did exist.
Voronov understood that all these methods were just a con. No one had ever been able to find the secret of perennial youth, even though man had tried to solve this secret through the ages. For example, in the East, they ate dried elephant skin to rejuvenate, with the theory, the more you ate, the younger you'd become. In the West, during the Middle Ages, rich men ate mixtures of gold and powdered jewelry. They even secretly committed crimes like killing babies. After the ritual sacrifice, their blood was consumed as a rejuvenating drink. But even this was not the most outrageous craze performed in the quest for eternal life. For example, Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory took daily baths in the blood of murdered virgins. At her 40th birthday, Elizabeth looked like a 20-year-old girl. When her crimes were revealed, even rejuvenating baths couldn't help the Countess. She died in jail of old age. Young Voronov read about all of these terrible and bloody searches for eternal youth and couldn't believe his eyes. People went to every length to get perennial youth. The better he understood the price of the secret, the more he wanted to become the first to discover it. After all, the opportunity was a gift in itself. After graduation from Sorbonne, the talented Dr. Voronov was invited to Egypt to look after the health of the country's governor. So, Voronov rushed to the east, still hoping to unravel the puzzles of eternity.
In the East, they always considered it prestigious to have a European doctor in the court. Voronov had access not only to the body of the king, but also to his harem. Suddenly, the attention of the young doctor was captured, not by women, but by the eunuchs, harem supervisors castrated in their childhood.
While watching these Egyptian castrated men, Voronov noticed that all of them were apathetic, fat, and bluntish. They had poor memory and slow reactions. The most important thing was that they aged much more quickly.
Their aging processes were accelerated. They very quickly forgot things, and they also gained weight easily. Voronov came to the conclusion that castration was the reason of these such processes. He started to think about the consequences of transplantation, of reproductive organs from dead people or from animals.
We can do it vice versa. If genitals of a young man are transplanted to an old man, the rejuvenation reaction will happen. Voronov decided to check his theory in Egypt. He asked to be brought the oldest and the weakest animal. This was a 13-year-old male sheep. In a simple Egyptian hanger, Voronov executed his first operation and transplanted a testicle of a young lamb to the old sheep. A miracle happened. After 2 months, it was hard to recognize the old sheep. Now it was an animal with nice posture, vivid sight, shining and thick wool. Sometime later, a local sheep gave birth to a healthy lamb, whose father was this rejuvenated ram. Voronov returned to France from Egypt, absolutely certain the experiment was worth trying on humans. Soon after in Paris, with the help of his Sorbonne instructors, Voronov conducted his first mass experiment. He obtained access to the organs of criminals who had been executed. Voronov cut out their testicles and proposed giving free of charge rejuvenating transplants. These pioneering operations created a real sensation in France. Elderly Voronov's patients got visibly younger in front of everybody. They also instinctively began behaving as young men with renewed vigor. Soon after, rumors spread in high society about Voronov's project. Aging millionaires started to queue up for the rejuvenation treatment. The numbers interested in receiving donor organs soon outweighed the number of organs available. Because of this, Voronov decided to use apes as donors.
Why did he choose apes? Dr. Voronov considered that their organs are more stable. Gorillas, chimpanzees and baboons don't suffer from rheumatism, syphilis, and are not prone to alcoholism. Dr. Voronov didn't know that apes can become the source of an infection lethal for humans. He knew nothing at the time about the apish virus, which would ultimately go on to strike humanity.
It was the 12th of July 1920. French doctor Sergei Voronov was the first in the world to successfully attempt transplantation of ape organs into a human. Cuts of the chimpanzee and baboon testicles were grafted into the scrotum of an aging British millionaire recipient. The whole of France waited impatiently for the results of the operation. How would the patient feel? Would the testicles of an ape survive in a man's body?
The operation was very successful. The millionaire climbed up Mont Blanc with an expedition of mountain climbers and took part in different activities. But there was still one problem. In spite of the effectiveness of the operation, its effect was only temporary, and it was decided a follow-up operation must be performed within 3 to 4 years after the first.
What Voronov did not know was that his operations were to release a deadly virus into the human population, which we still cannot cure to this day. This lethal virus is now known the world over as acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS.
When scientists started to discover the origins of the HIV infection, they considered the theory of apes being initial virus carriers. They found significant HIV risks present during the sex organ transplants from apes to humans.
Nobody knows the exact operation that allowed the transportation of the AIDS virus into the human population. Although it is practically proven that it happened through Voronov's transplants. And most gerontologists believe this to be the case. The virus took a fair amount of time to present itself. However, when the infection spread, the doctors knew that it was like nothing they had encountered before. Voronov was dismissive of the virus. He was totally convinced that he had presented people with a real chance at achieving eternal life. In the 20s, he actively performed operations on prime ministers, financiers, bankers and diplomats. He even founded an apish nursery on the French Riviera to ensure the constant supply of organs. All the newspapers reported on the wonderful results of the experiments carried out by the daring surgeon. Voronov became a millionaire. He rented the first floor of one of the most expensive hotels in Paris and surrounded himself with servants, secretaries, guards, and courtesans.
If you are too old for dancing, get yourself monkey testicles. The lyrics to this song were very popular in Parisian clubs at that time. Sergei Voronov became a real star of the French capital. Songs were written about him, and best banquets were organized in honor of him. Meanwhile, fashionable Parisian barman Harry McElhone even created a cocktail, Monkey Gland, named after his technique of grafting monkey testicle tissue into humans. A cocktail of gin, absinthe, grenadine and orange juice warmed up the eager public, and everyone hoped that eternal life may actually be possible. The drink did appear to be a more realistic option than Voronov's daring experiments.
Up until 1924, the year of Lenin's death, Voronov had performed 53 successful operations. Leaders in the Kremlin kept a keen eye on Voronov's progress. coming next. A proposition from the Kremlin. Who among Soviet bosses had agreed to an ape-testicle transplant? Bulgakov's foresight. Strange freight from New Guinea. How were girl members of the Young Communist League crossbred with gorillas? Had Stalin discovered this new theory of eternal life? In 1925, Stalin received news of the phenomenal success of Parisian Dr. Voronov. Having researched him, Stalin and his party decided to invite Voronov to the Soviet Union. They hoped that baboon hormones and that of orangutans and gorillas could help them to avoid multiple sclerosis, which had claimed Lenin's life. Voronov didn't accept the Bolshevik proposal. He didn't want to leave Europe, the Europe that applauded him and showered him with success and celebrity. Why would he want to leave Paris for the hungry and revolution-wrecked Moscow? The Bolsheviks then decided to copy Voronov's method and decided to teach talented Soviet doctors to perform the transplants. But who could be trusted with such an important and delicate task? The only doctor who had access to both great leaders, Lenin and Stalin, was a general surgeon, Vladimir Rozanov. "This surgeon is the best," wrote Lenin about Rozanov. In 1918, after the attempted murder of Illich, Rozanov successfully operated on him and continued as his physician and surgeon until Lenin's death. In addition, Rozanov was entrusted to remove Stalin's appendix. So it came to be that Vladimir Rozanov was chosen to perform this important mission. The first Bolshevik transplantation of monkeys' organs into humans. Rozanov agreed. He had long been a key observer of Voronov's work in Paris and was ready to give an adequate Soviet answer to the bourgeois surgeon.
After special instructions from Dr. Rozanov, 2 monkeys were sent to the Kremlin laboratory. Rumor has it that these animals have been earmarked as donors for 2 brave Bolsheviks, writer Maxim Gorky and security officer Vyacheslav Menzinsky. Some suggested that these men were operated on, but no rumors were ever substantiated. Only one official document about this operation remains in existence. It is dated December 29, 1925, and its content is rather ambiguous.
It read, "In response to request number 2022, Botkin Hospital informs that it is desirable for them to have 50 monkeys per year. Large breeds are preferred, Hamadryas baboons, other baboons, and at least 2 chimpanzees. Monkeys are needed for experiments and for transplantation of human endocrine glands." So it would seem that the operations did take place and that they were deemed to be successful. The Kremlin demanded more monkeys. The problem was how to transport them into the Soviet Union without provoking suspicions. After a short time researching, a monkey enthusiast was found. It was Professor Ivanov, a biologist of international fame. He was the first in the world to attempt artificial breeding, to get hybrids of donkey and zebra, antelope and cow, mice and rat, guinea pig and rabbit. However, he had his own precious dream, the same as Voronov had: to crossbreed a human with an ape.
Professor Ivanov believed that experiments with hybridization would create hybrids to become an exclusive source of organs for transplantation. Then such hybrids could have been domesticated. They would be as strong as chimpanzees, with a 25 times faster response time than humans. Such hybrids could shatter stones and also be capable of being trained. They could live in the north, in the area of Novaya Zemlya, in the regions of atomic weapon testing. They could become objects for military experiments.
The Soviet government allocated funds to Professor Ivanov, so he left for Guinea. Before his departure, Ivanov received a personal directive from Comrade Stalin.
We must bypass nature. Politburo gives you 5 years to complete your experiment. Good luck.
After just a year, a ship containing cages full of monkeys returned to the Soviet Union. All of them had been caught by Professor Ivanov. At the same time, he gave instructions to organize the search for volunteers to participate in an historic experiment: crossbreeding of monkeys and humans. It had to be young, healthy women. But what normal female would want to enter into sexual intercourse with a monkey? Incredibly, there were many volunteers who came forward. A lot of women from the Young Communist League stepped forward to help in the name of Soviet science. These Soviet women were willing to become pregnant by gorillas and orangutans and give birth to little ape men for free, for the benefit of the motherland and for science. Even though there were many volunteers, only 5 of them could participate in the experiment. So competition was fierce.
I shall comply with all requirements related to the experiment. I believe in the possibilities of fertilization. Worst case, if I'm not chosen, then please send me the address of any of the foreign zoologists.
All female members of the Young Communist League who had to be artificially fertilized by animal sperm had to be healthy, physically strong, and with great vitality. In Ivanov's laboratory, they were called special employees and kept in a separate isolated room for the sake of clarity of the experiment. While the professor was preparing for the historic crossbreeding of a monkey with a human, in the Kremlin they excitedly awaited the new animals. These monkeys needed to become donors for the aging party bosses, so it was in Moscow's interest to be patient. However, unexpectedly, Professor Ivanov stood up for his apes.
Moscow sent a letter to Sukhumi, requesting 2 more monkeys. Suddenly, they were met with a negative response. We have sent you monkeys before, and the results were regrettable. The apes had apparently been used for organ transplantations into high-ranking officers, and nothing is known about the results. Maybe somebody had died. Perhaps the operation turned out to be unsuccessful. An ape could have died as the result of it.
Ivanov understood that resistance impacted heavily on his work and that his own experiment could be jeopardized. Apes were very hard to come by because not all animals survived during the trip from New Guinea to the Soviet Union. The apes who did survive during the trip started to die from stress an unfamiliar climate, and bad diet. There were no refrigerators in Sukhumi for tropical fruits, so the animals were fed boiled eggs and jam, and many of them died. Ivanov planned to use the surviving apes for his experiment of crossbreeding with young women.
It's believed that Ilya Ivanovich hoped to get the Nobel Prize, and he had real chances of winning it. It could be seen as a scientific breakthrough. Everything was proven theoretically. The problem was only with the practical evidence. As it turned out, it was very hard to crossbreed humans with apes between 1929 and 1930.
As a result, there was a great divide of opinion in medical circles. Moscow and Sukhumi couldn't share apes, and there weren't enough for both experiments, one concerned with rejuvenation and the other concerned with crossbreeding. All this soon erupted into an international scandal, and the focus turned to the maverick professor Ivanov. The fate of extraordinary crossbreeding was sealed by the popular press. American newspapers wrote about crazy Soviet experiments breeding half human, half apes. The research had to be quickly scaled down and classified as secret. To prove that monkeys were used only for the ordinary medical experiments, an institute in Sukhumi was founded, performing only medical research. Ivanov ignored the rules and refused to give his monkeys for donor transplant organs. He was arrested and deported from Sukhumi. So did Ivanov ever manage to carry out his experiment? The truth is still hidden in the secret archives of the NKVD. We know of only one piece of correspondence from the professor, which he wrote to his Moscow colleagues from Sukhumi. A hybrid person related to anthropoids grows faster from birth than a human baby. Until the age of 3 or 4, he gains incredible power. He is much less sensitive to pain and undemanding. Of all delights, he prefers sexual pleasures. His most important advantage over living creatures, including humans, is an ease of management and an impeccable obedience. Useful potential of the hybrid creature is boundless. From work in the wet coal faces to military service. So we can assume Professor Ivanov managed to crossbreed a man with a monkey. But what happened to these hybrids? Were they used in the call of duty for their country? Did they die in captivity in a secret Sukhumi laboratory? Answers to these questions are still unknown. We know only that the arrest of Professor Ivanov did not put an end to the experiments in the Soviet Union. In fact, there was much interest shown in them. In 1925, Professor Bryanenko presented a dog's head on a dish to the medical community. The head blinked, stuck out its tongue, and even ate a sausage. Another professor, Zavadovsky, boasted about his achievements, namely changing the sex of a cock into a hen. At the same time, near Leningrad, scientists were working on creating a Soviet Itiandra, crossbreeding a man and a shark. Most of these experiments were carried out in strict secrecy. People and animals quietly died in laboratories. Soviet doctors on Stalin's instruction were exerting ultimate control over nature, even if they had to do so with extreme force. The world learned of this strange time through Mikhail Bulgakov's novel, A Dog's Heart.
I shall transplant monkey ovaries to you.
Really? Is it possible? A monkey?
Yes, it can.
When shall the operation take place?
On Monday.
Bulgakov was sure that all attempts to turn the animal into a human, to bring to life a new creature, or to change the nature of it, were doomed to fail at the outset. Sharik may become Sharikov, but only on the outside. Professor Preobrazhensky was the only person who would take full responsibility for his experiments. That was the uniqueness of Bulgakov's prophecy. A popular surgeon, Sergei Voronov, became a new version of the professor in A Dog's Heart.
Dr. Bulgakov must have had clairvoyant gifts. In the 20s, he predicted the casting out of Voronov's ideas, and he was not mistaken. There were no good results that came of the clinical experiments of the French professor. After 2 years, in 1927, the world celebrity Voronov suddenly became a worldwide laughingstock.
That year, the first British millionaire patient operated on by Voronov had suddenly died, and was the first in a number of subsequent deaths. All brave rich men with monkey's testicles quickly aged and died. Voronov would not admit defeat, but the evidence was clear. The monkey-derived elixir of youth did not work.
It turned out that male genital transplants have a significant effect on men. In the way that an energy drink might. At first, the man experienced a real boost, but the effect was temporary. And the end result is a horrible reverse effect. Patients aged quickly, but continued to experience strong sexual desire. For the creation of such infirm and oversexed old men, Voronov got his offensive nickname, Dr. Erector. Ultimately, he was forced to close the clinic and stop his experiments.
In the Soviet Union, Voronov-style experiments stopped only after the war. Mikhail Kalinin was the last victim of these experiments. In 1945, a prominent surgeon, Boris Pedrovsky, transplanted the testicles of a young man into a 70-year-old Kalinin. After 4 weeks, the body of the recipient became rejuvenated. His grey hair disappeared. His voice altered. He had a spring in his step. But just 3 months went by before the process of quick aging began. And 8 months later, Kalinin died. Stalin learned about this failure, but didn't stop the search for the elixir of youth. He spent another 10 years looking for it. He sent researchers to the Caucasus Mountains to find the secret of longevity there. He drank only spring water and ate the best food. Stalin founded important gerontology institutes in Kiev and Kharkov. He personally called their directors to keep track of their progress. But to no avail. His death was instantaneous. he died of a brain hemorrhage. Lonely, paralyzed and weak, he was lying on the floor, while in the next room, his comrades quietly and patiently waited for his death. However, after Stalin's death, the quest for longevity continued with interest. The next rulers of the Kremlin were also afraid of dying young. They invested heavily in developing drugs to combat aging. For rejuvenation, they chose to drink water from the Antarctic and took shots of embryonic tissue. Every day, Chinese leader Mao Zedong drank 2 liters of women's breast milk. But it was all in vain. Each of them died as an ordinary mortal man would have done, in the usual way. Were the efforts of hundreds of doctors, gerontologists, physiologists and researchers useless? What legacy do these experiments leave with us? Incredibly, it turns out the development saved thousands of lives. The experiments carried out by Dr. Bogdanov helped create the Institute of Blood Transfusion, which saved thousands of lives. In Sukhumi, all essential medicines were tested on monkeys. They also used monkeys for space travel, in a spaceship similar to the one in which Yuri Gagarin flew. What about the secret of eternal youth? Scientists are still searching for it. Strange experiments are now carried out in the secret laboratories of Moscow, Peking, Tokyo, and the USA, just as they were in the 1920s. Their task remains the same: to find the secret of eternity. Their results are equally unsuccessful. That is because no researcher has yet managed to answer another important question. Do humans need eternity?